we are going to talk about bands and how to use them on the rack and off the rack. So we're going to go over a couple of different things. First one's going to be how to set up your bands for a squat. Second will be how to set up your bands for a deadlift. And then last we'll go over how to set them up on the bench. I see a lot of our distance clients setting up their bands in kind of a hodgepodge of ways. So I just want to make sure that we have the same expectations of what that looks like. First of all, obviously you're going to use 2 bands when we're talking about using it on a barbell, and you want to every so often just check your bands. Check that the tension is roughly the same. Over time, you're using them for warm-ups, doing pull-aparts and adductor abductor moves. So just make sure that your tension is roughly the same on both of the bands that you're using. And they should definitely be a matching pair. You shouldn't use 2 different companies or 2 different colors when you're doing any sort of band work. So first up for the squat, we are going to set up our pins. You may or may not be using pins. You might just be using your rack, and that's okay too. But for right now, I'm going to show you how to use the pins. And for a squat, I'm going to have the pins out because the band is actually going to go on the outside of the collar for the squat. It's going to go on the inside when we're doing the deadlift. So here we're going to line up our band so that it's doubled up and totally straight. You want to make sure you get all the kinks out of it because, again, we just want to minimize difference in tension. So if one is twisted and one isn't, then you're going to have a little bit of variability. And so minimizing that as much as possible is what we want to do. So lining it up, making sure it's nice and straight all the way down, undoing any sort of kinks in it. And then I'm going to hang it so that my loops are down like this and it's stacked on top of itself here. And we're going to put it on first before we put any weight on. So looping it as close to the rack as possible. My pins on this one are on holes 3 and 5. That might be different for you. We want it to be in line with your squat. We don't want it to be hugely offset from the front or the back. So for me, and generally on these racks, it's hole 3 and hole 5 that accommodate that. So once I have them evenly around the pins, I'm going to keep them stacked here and pull it hard up and around. And then once I get it on the bar, I'm just going to shore it up as close as I can to the collar and stack one right on top of the other. So that's how we would set this up for a squat. Now for a deadlift, generally we're going to double this up. If you have a platform that has hooks, you can use that. And then in that case, you would just double your band up one time and hook it to the pins on either side of the deadlift platform. If you don't, and you're using a rack, you're going to have your pins in, or you would just use the rack itself. And then we're going to create a little more tension by doubling it here. So again, we're stacking it, getting all the kinks out of it, we're doubling it up, and then we're going to use the pins and just hook it on this side, put it over the bar on the inside of the collar, and then hook it on the other pin. Okay, so the other option there is to, again, shore it up, make sure it's nice and straight, and then around, double it up, and then around the rack, put it around the rack so that it's the loops are on the outside, and then pull it up and around the bar so that, again, it's on the inside of the collar for the deadlift. All right, guys, let's talk about the bench press. You are going to have your pins facing out. Remember on the deadlift, we had them facing in. On the squat, it was out, but at the front of the rack on pins 3 and 5. Now we're gonna have it on towards the back of the rack on 3 and 5. So coming from the back of the rack, count the holes inward, or you can also use the bottom of your rack as well, but preferably on pins. Now we're going to straighten out our band again, make sure there's no kinks in it. We'll double it up here, put it around the pins, loop it around, one on each, and then we're going to pull it up and around and stack them nice and evenly, again, as close to the collar as we can, just like we did on the squat. So you really want to shore up the bands on the pins and make sure they're even on both sides. And then again, on the top of it, make sure they're stacked and nicely situated there. We always want to have them on the inside of the weights. We want the bands to be as close to our center of gravity as possible, regardless of whether we are on the squat, the deadlift, or the bench press. Obviously, the deadlift, we're going to have the bands on the inside. They're going to be a little bit messier than they are with the squat or the bench press, and that's okay. But just try and get them as neat and as uniform as possible. Now, for some of you, you don't have a full setup at home, and that's okay too. So when you're using dumbbells or kettlebells and your band, the way that we're gonna wanna do that, again, we're gonna wanna stack it, make it as uniform as possible so that we get equal tension on both sides. And then when we are doing our lying floor press, holding your weights in your hand, you can press from this position with the bands on the outsides of your arm, or you can put them on the insides of your arm and press from there. It's gonna be a little bit less tension. I prefer the outside, here, and press. And it's not gonna give you the exact same band resistance that you're gonna get from the rack, but at least you'll get some.